All right, Facebook, we are back live from the Oasis. I get to share with you this time, in case you don't know me, if it's your first time, I'm Mike Davis, one of the teaching pastors at the Oasis in Chino, California. Let's pray and then we'll get into our study. Father, as always, we look to you. We thank you for what we studied up until this point. We thank you as we begin to conclude our study of First Timothy chapter 2. Lord God, that you just lead us and continue to guide us in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so we are still talking about who's the boss, women and men in biblical and cultural context. We have been for quite a while now talking about First Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. And I just want to say, when I started on this, one of the things I recognized that we needed to do was to do what I call reconstruct the world of First Timothy 2:12. What I've seen over and over and over when people, and I would say, my opinion, complementarians or popular complementarian pastors on YouTube, when they talk about women in ministry and they say that women are not allowed to be pastors, women are not allowed to be elders, they tend to start with First Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. They'll take that verse and they'll start. Sometimes they'll back up to verse 9. But they'll use that and they'll just say, see the plain reading of the text. And they don't look at the text in light of its historical, cultural, linguistic, and literary context. So what I sought to do when we started this study was to reconstruct the world of which the text, First Timothy 2:12, was written out of. One of the things, and we were just talking about this or talking about this person in our Facebook group, the late Dr. Michael Heiser. One of the things that he once said was that, I'm paraphrasing a little bit, that when you study the biblical text, the right context for the text is not your denomination, your denomination's theology, but it is the context in which the passage that you're studying or reading was written out of. And when it comes to First Timothy, the book itself, the epistle itself, it was written within a first century Greco-Roman context. And it's important for us to understand the world in which it was written in order for us to better understand what is it that Paul was communicating to us? What is it that God, through Paul, was seeking to communicate to us? I've often said, and I've come to believe, that if we're going to understand what God is saying to us by his spirit through his word, we need to properly understand first what God has said, which means we got to go back into the context. So this is what we sought to do with First Timothy chapter 2 and verse 12. Go back into the historical and cultural context, the language, and try to rebuild the world out of which this text came so we can better understand it. Okay, so what we're going to be doing now is, because we've been on it for quite some time, we're going to conclude our study of First Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. And so let me just read it real quick. First Timothy chapter 2, verse 12. Let me go start at verse 9. Paul says, in like manner also the women. Let me start at verse 8. I desire therefore that the men pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. In like manner also that the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. Let a woman learn in silence with all submission. And in verse 12, I do not permit a woman to teach or to have authority over a man, but to be in silence. For Adam was formed first, then Eve, and Adam was not deceived, but the woman being deceived fell into transgression. Nevertheless, she will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. We have looked at in detail all of those passages, even backing all the way up to chapter 1 and reading down. Okay, so this is the conclusion that I've arrived at, and the conclusion is that these passages in First Timothy chapter 2, especially verse 12, they do not exclude women leadership. They do not exclude women from, quote, senior leadership, though that term doesn't appear in scripture. For so many people this week, as I've listened to different videos on First Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, talk about senior leadership. I was like, that term is not in the text. But I'm going to use that for a moment. So First Timothy chapter 2, verse 12, or any of the verses before and after, they do not exclude women from senior leadership in the church or from being a pastor in the church, specifically women being pastors in a church where there might be men, so women having authority over men as a pastor does not exclude them from that. Now, if you're watching this for the first time, you said, I disagree, you got to go back and watch all the videos that I've done on this and how we came to this conclusion. We've done it in quite detail. But what about, I'm saying 1 Timothy 2:12 especially does not exclude women from leadership. It does not exclude women from being pastors in a church, even being the senior or lead pastor. Somebody might say that, but what about 1 Timothy, Mike, chapter 3, verses 1 through 7? Let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. This is going to be our text that we're going to look at today. It says, this is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober minded, of good behavior, hospitable, able to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money, but gentle, not quarrelsome, not covetous, one who rules his own household well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation as the devil. Moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. Now, this passage has often been read in complementarian circles. This is read as excluding women from being an elder or a pastor. But does this passage actually exclude women from leadership in terms of being an elder or a pastor in the church? Complementarians will say it does. Complementarians like Mike Winger will say it does. Complementarians like I'm gonna introduce this today. His name is Alan Parr. He has a YouTube channel called The Beat. Said, yeah, this excludes women. And other complementarians, mostly all complementarians will say, yes, this excludes women. I don't know a complementarian who says it doesn't. So we're going to look at two complementarians who said that this passage does exclude women from leadership as an elder, pastor, teacher over men. And we're going to look at their reasons for doing so. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to play some video clips of these men saying this so you can hear it from their own mouths so that I am not accused of taking them out of context. So what we're going to listen to first is a brother, and I believe he's a brother in the Lord, named Alan Parr. He has a YouTube channel called The Beat. We're going to listen to a video of his called If Your Church Has a Female Pastor, Leave Now, and Here's Why. Yes, that's the name of his video. If your church has a female pastor, leave now, and here's why. We're going to listen to two clips of his. So let me set this up for you, and then we're going to listen to something from Mike Winger. Let's see if I got it set it up. No, I do not. Hang on for just a second. I thought I did. Got to reconfigure some things here. Let's make sure this is correct. Okay, here we go. Okay, I think it's set up now. So I'm going to have to watch this because as I have been delving into the world of YouTube, I found out that in order to avoid getting in trouble, you have to pay a certain amount at a time. You can't play it. You shouldn't do more than 30 seconds. So let me set this up. Let me play it. And I'm going to play this for you now.
1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1, which says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. So I want you to take special notice here of the third person masculine pronoun he that Paul uses throughout this entire passage. So essentially he's saying if a man desires to be an overseer, then he desires a noble task. Now let's keep going. It also that is 1 Timothy chapter 3 verse 1.
Okay, so what he is doing here, he is reading from 1 Timothy chapter 3, which we just read. Let me play it for you one more time so you can hear what he says in this clip as to why a woman is excluded from being a pastor or an elder in a church. Let me play this again.
1, which says, the saying is trustworthy. If anyone aspires to the office of overseer, he desires a noble task. So I want you to take special notice here of the third person masculine pronoun he that Paul uses throughout this entire passage. So essentially he's saying if a man desires to be an overseer, then he desires a noble task. Now let's keep.
Okay, so what he is saying, if you're hearing him correctly here, he is saying that that the reason why this is restricted to men is because when you read the text, and I know in my New King James Version, I'm not sure what version he was reading from, but my New King James Version, and in many versions it says, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. Then it says a bishop must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober-minded, able to teach, not given to wine, gentle, quarrelsome, one who rules his own household well. Um, then verse 5, for if a man does not know how to rule his own household, then in verse 7, or excuse me, verse 6, the person no, verse 5, for if he does not know how to rule his own household, how will he take care of the church? Verse 6, not a novice, lest being puffed up with pride, he fall into the same condemnation of the devil. Verse 7, moreover, he must have a good testimony among those who are outside. So what Alan Parr is saying is notice the third person masculine pronoun he that is used. And for him, this means, he interprets this to mean, this only applies to men. So only men can be elders because it uses the third person masculine pronoun in our English Bibles, uses the third person masculine pronoun. Okay. So that's clip number one. Let me now play for you another clip of his. So let me stop sharing for a second, make sure that this works here. I'm gonna play it again. Okay, so hopefully you can see that. So I'm gonna play the second clip of him talking about this.
Therefore, an overseer must be above reproach, the husband of one wife, the husband of one wife, the husband of one wife, sober minded, self controlled, respectable, hospitable, able to teach. So, by saying that a church leader or an overseer must be the husband of one wife, automatically disqualifies any woman from actually being the sole or the co-pastor of a church exercising authority, because it's impossible for a woman to be a husband of one wife. Now,
Okay, so I think you got that one there. So what is he saying here? He's saying that because it says husband of one wife, therefore that disqualifies any woman, because a woman cannot be a husband of one wife. And you notice he emphasized three times husband of one wife, husband of one wife, husband of one wife. Therefore, because a woman cannot be a husband of one wife, again, he's reading the English text, because a woman cannot be the husband of one wife. Therefore, women are excluded from being an elder. All right, so he's looking upon First Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 is giving the qualifications for being an elder, a pastor. What he and others sometimes refer to as a lead pastor or a senior pastor, which means you're over other people in the congregation. Women are excluded from that because uh, according to Alan Parr, these are masculine terms. He sees the word he, or his. Third, there's third person masculine, and then he sees husband of one wife. Those automatically exclude women. Okay, got that? All right, now that's from his own mouth. Again, you can go back if anybody's thinking I'm taking him out of context. Go back and watch his video. If your church has a female pastor, leave now. Here's why. He believes because of the masculine terms that are used, they exclude women. Okay, now what about Mike Winger? Let's look at Mike Winger. This is from his video, Women Leaders in the New Testament. It's video number 4. Women Leaders in the New Testament, video number 4. And let me pull that up for you. Let's see. Hang on just one second again. I got to make sure that everything is set up properly. Yeah. Okay. There we go. Okay. All right. Here we go. Yep. There he is. And let's play Mike now.
So these are the requirements for elders. These are people who can be appointed as elders. This is definitely the leadership role in the church. This is like the exact specific requirements. Notice how masculine they are. Like, you can't get around it. Now you could try, but I mean, you should at least notice it, right? he desires a noble task. There are some who say this is completely gender neutral, that all these descriptions all the way through are gender neutral. But he's to be what? He's to be the husband of one wife. That's one of the descriptions. He's to be one who rules his own house well. That and again, manages his own household. This seems to be talking about males here specifically.
Now, let me stop again for just a moment, because again, I want to keep in alignment with the copyright laws. So what Mike is saying here is that he had just previously read 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and he also is looking at the masculine terms in the English translation. I believe he's utilizing the ESV, and he's looking at the masculine terms, and he's saying, no, this only applies to men. Then when he gets to, it talks about he should rule his house well, he is saying this only applies to men. It says he. They would have understood this as applying to the men, not to women. Okay, let's go back and finish the rest of it.
And in their culture, I don't think they would have, I think that's how they would have interpreted that. In verses 6 and 7, it also indicates he. Let me take you to verses 6 and 7. Right? He must not be a recent convert, or he may become puffed up, right? He must be thought well of by outsiders. It is masculine. This stuff seems it seems like only guys can fill these roles of eldership. So uniquely, the one requirement that's different on elders that you don't find anywhere else for other requirements is the able to teach requirement. The elder has to be able to teach. Everything else is character related. We don't need people who are good on stage. We need people who are able to teach. There's a difference. We don't need people who can move a crowd.
So let me just say one more time. So if you see what Mike said, that when it comes to it, that these are all, he says it seems very masculine. These are all masculine. He quotes verses 6 and 7 where he uses the word he, and he points out he sees it as being masculine. Therefore, the qualifications for leadership for being an elder applies only to men. Therefore, because it's using masculine terms, it excludes women. The masculine terms that he's reading in his English translation. Let me see if there's anything else to this.
That's bad, but that's not the requirement. We need people who have godly character and have the capacity to teach. These are the things. Godly character shown consistently in the world, in their home, and in their interactions with people. They're dealing with the sin in their life and the godliness in the way that they present themselves, and they are able to teach. Because why? Because elders are the official teachers in the church. So they taught in a very official and specific capacity in the church. They specifically are carrying along the apostolic doctrine of like who Jesus is. And
okay, I'm going to stop there. I think that's all that we needed from that. All right. So again, what we're clear on is that Mike teaches. And again, if you're wondering, where is this coming from? If you look at his video, again, it's called Women Leaders in the New Testament, it's video number 4. His belief is that these passages only apply to men because when you read the English text, there's a reason I'm saying that on purpose, it uses masculine terminology. It uses masculine words, he, him, husband of one wife. Alan Parr and Mike Winger are on the same page where this is concerned. So on the basis of what both of these brothers say, women are excluded from the church. On the basis of what? It is based upon the third person masculine pronouns that are used, the word he, and it is based upon the words husband of one wife. Mike also extend this to the fact that it says in verse, verse 4, one who rules his own household well. Mike says they would have understood this in this day as referring to men, implying not to women. This would have been understood as referring only to men. So for them, this means that the position of elder that we read about in verse 1, if anyone desires the position of a bishop, is it's episcopus or episcopus, episcope or episcopus in we can translate it as bishop or elder. If anyone desires that office, they see this as being only applicable to men. But is this the case? Is this the case? Are there aspects of this passage that are left out and misunderstood that if we bring out these facts, it would alter and change the conclusion that women are restricted from being elders based on the reason that these two brothers and other complementarians give? If we bring in certain facts that they have left out, that they've misunderstood? Would this alter the conclusion? Would this alter how we read the text? And the answer is yes. And let me say, I've watched several videos over the past week, especially over the past few days, that deal with this passage, 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. I really wanted to see how people were interpreting it. And every complementarian that I listened to always interpreted this text the same way. They were looking at the masculine terms that are used, especially husband of one wife. That was the big one that everybody focuses on. And they were saying, see, this is why this is excluded from women. But they would also look at some of the other, it says he. It says he here. It says he in this passage. So this excludes women. However, there are things that they left out. There are facts that they didn't bring in. There are misunderstandings that they had reading the English of the text. So let's get into it. What are some of the key facts left out of the complementarian argument for 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7? The first fact that is left out is in verse number 1. If you go back to verse number 1, it says, this is a faithful saying. If a man desires the position of a bishop or elder, he desires a good work. Now, some people reading this, like my New King James Version Bible, has the word there, man. But here's the thing. In the Greek, it says in our English, if any man desires. However, this is misleading. The Greek text, and you can look this up, the Greek text does not say if any man desires. If it said in the Greek text any man, it would translate the Greek term aner, A-N-E-R. Doesn't have the word there in the Greek. Aner is not used. The word that is used that they translate as man is a Greek term tis, T-I-S. That's the word. Look it up. In the Greek, it is tis. And tis is a gender neutral or a gender inclusive term, and it can mean anyone. Okay. It is what we call an indefinite pronoun. So it's not referring to anyone or anything specifically. So literally, this text could be translated as if anyone, and there are translations, by the way, that translate it this way. I think the NIV may do it, maybe the CEP, I'm not sure, but this text can be translated as, and rightfully so, if anyone desires the office of an episcopus, or an elder, they desire a good work. So it is not specifically saying if a man, that is a male, desires. It is saying if anyone, this is an indefinite pronoun. I'm just telling you what the Greek says. It is an indefinite pronoun. It's not pointing specifically to a man or to a woman. It is saying anyone. In other words, it includes both men and women. Here's the thing that's important. In this verse, there are no third person masculine pronouns in verse number 1. There is not. There is no third person masculine pronoun in verse number 1. So that's the first fact that we want to look at. Here's the second fact. This is the one that Mike pushed. This is the one that Alan Parr pushed. That, hey, if you look at it, Alan Parr said, look at what it says here. If any man desires the position of ability, he desires a good work. And he must be the husband of one wife, and he must be blameless. And he says, pay attention to the third person masculine pronoun. Here's the thing that Alan seemed to be unaware of. In the Greek, there are no third person masculine pronouns. There is no he in the Greek to translate. It's not there in the Greek. It is not used in any of the passages from verse 1 through 7. There are no third person masculine pronouns that we would translate as he in the Greek. Not there. Where is he getting that from? He's simply reading the English. He didn't go check the Greek. When I first learned this, and I have to attribute this to Dr. Philip Payne. When I first learned this from reading Dr. Payne's book, it's this one here. Let me pull it up here. This book here, Man and Woman, One in Christ. When I first read that and he said that, I went, are you really? And I went and looked it up. I pulled it up, looked it up in Greek. I went, oh my gosh, it's not there. It's not there at all. So here's fact number 2. There are no third person masculine pronouns. There is no he used in any of the passages in the original Greek, not one. Again, this is Alan Parr's argument. This is Mike Winger's argument. And they say that because they are reading the English translation where it says he. And and that because it says he, their position therefore is that this is restricted only to men and it excludes women, but this is wrong. Again, if you look in the Greek, you will find no third person masculine pronoun. So why do the translations have the word he there? Okay, it is because many of the nouns that are used, like the word bishop in verse 2, have what we call, or what is called in Greek, a masculine form. There are certain languages that have gender to them. It can be what we call, a word can be have a masculine form to it, or masculine gender or feminine gender. We don't have that in English, but they have it in languages like Greek. They have it in Hebrew. They have it in Spanish. They have it in French. Okay, so like if I'm talking, let's say we got people here in the room. If I'm talking to Aaron Richard, I go, yeah, Aaron's my amigo. Okay, if I'm speaking Spanish, amigo, that's the masculine form, and I will say he's my amigo. But if I'm talking to some of the ladies, I'll say these are my, like one of the ladies here is named Cheryl. I go, Cheryl's my amiga. Okay, that's the feminine form. Okay, now in Greek, you can have masculine or feminine form. So why do we have the word translated as he? Because the word like bishop, the word bishop is in the masculine form. Now let me read to you what Dr. Philip Payne says in another book of his, The Bible versus Biblical Womanhood. This is on page 152. He says, it is a simple, it is simply Greek convention or a Greek rule that now listen to this, when groups of people are addressed, let me read this again. It is simply Greek convention or Greek rule that when groups of people are addressed, to use masculine grammatical forms. The masculine is used in speaking of persons generally, even when only one woman is in view. Let me read that again. It is simple Greek convention. It is the Greek rule of grammar that when you are addressing groups of people, you utilize the masculine grammatical form. The masculine grammatical form is used in speaking of persons generally, even when only one woman is in view. Now, if you've been following the series, you've heard me talk about this. So let's say, and by the way, this is true of Hebrew, this is true of Spanish, this is true of French. When you are speaking about groups of people, the default in Greek is to use a masculine form, even if there's only one woman involved. So again, if I am talking to my friend Cheryl, and let's say I'm talking to Cheryl, I'm talking to another person here, my friend Sharon, my friend Lorna, my friend Paula. I go, oh, these are my amigas, right? Spanish, my amigas. That, and I'm hoping I'm saying that correctly. That's the plural form, and it's in the feminine. But what if Aaron shows up and Aaron is here? I go, these are all my amigos. Even though there are women in the group, the default is to go to the masculine. You go, why? I don't know. Why it's the way they do it. But the default is to go to the masculine. Doesn't mean that there are no women. It is when you're speaking of groups and there are men and women involved, you default to the masculine form. Doesn't mean it only applies to the men. It encompasses both men and women. This is what we have here in the Greek when it says, and this is why it gets translated as bishop. It goes, he desires. The reason why is because it's the masculine form. Okay. So it's the masculine form. And we know it's referring to groups of people because of verse 1 when it says, if anyone, not any man, tis, if anyone, which includes men and women. But if you're going to include men and women and you're using a masculine form, you have to default to the masculine to make sure you encompass everyone. This is how it would have been understood in the Greek of Paul and Timothy's day. And as I said, this is true of Hebrew, it's true of Spanish, it's also true of French. Let me read to you something else from another scholar, Gordon Hugenberger. And I read his article. Let me read to you, and Philip Payne is the one who turned me on to the article. I went and looked it up. He has a quote from Hugenberger. Actually, I may have, let me see if I have the quote here actually on my iPad because I thought yeah, I do have it. Okay, cool. Okay, so this is an article that Gordon Hugenberger um, uh, wrote, and I believe you can find this at JSTOR. And this is what he says in this article. Let me find it here. As it is widely recognized, It is the common practice of the Bible to express legal norms from the male vantage point, perhaps as much to achieve an economy of expression as a reflection of circumstances that would have been culturally typical. The 10th commandment, for example, states, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his manservant," etc. The fact that this text mentions your neighbor's wife rather than your neighbor's husband, and that all of the references to you and your throughout the verse are masculine in Hebrew rather than feminine, ought not to be misinterpreted as if the commandment applies only to men. In the absence of other constraint norms that utilize male-oriented terminology ought to be construed in general as including both sexes in their purview. So what is he saying? He said, look, when you go to the Bible and you look at the 10th commandment, which says, "You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his manservant," the fact that it says your neighbor's wife, the fact that it says and rather than saying your neighbor's husband, does not mean it doesn't include women. In other words, well, it says you should not covet your neighbor's wife. So that commandment is only to men. It's okay for women to covet the husband, but it's not okay for men to covet the wives. No, he says that would be a misinterpretation, misapplication, a misunderstanding of the text. It is understood that when you're talking to groups of people, you default. He says it is how did he put it? He didn't say convention. He says it is in the absence of other constraints, norms. In other words, the normal way or customary way that utilizes male-oriented terminology ought to be construed in general as including both sexes in their purview. So he's saying, even though the text, and by the way, if you go through the 10 commandments, they're all written in the masculine form. So when it says, "Thou shalt not murder," it's written in the masculine. "Thou shalt not steal," that's written in the masculine. But we don't say, well, that only applies to men then because it's in the masculine. No, we understand that God was talking to all of Israel, therefore all of the group, therefore you default to the masculine form to encompass everyone. And it's the same way as we read here in 1 Timothy chapter 3 when it says that if anyone desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. A bishop must, or an elder must be blameless. So it is encompassing both men and women, but it utilizes, this is why I'm saying it translates it and adds the word that's not there in the original Greek. It adds the word he. In the Greek, there is no third person personal, third person masculine pronoun that would translate the word he. It is basing it off of, oh, we're using a masculine form, so we're going to put the word he in there to clarify the text. You could literally say, if anyone desires the office of a bishop, they desire, because that would be in keeping with the word tis, they desire a good work. Okay, is that clear? I hope that makes sense. This is probably why they put the word he in there, because the word bishop is in verse 2. The word bishop is in the masculine. Now you might say, somebody could say, well, I think it should be, because bishop is in masculine, is referring only to men. Well, then you got a problem. Because in verse 1, where it says, if anyone desires the office of a bishop or elder, the word bishop or elder there, same word, is in the feminine form. It's in the feminine form. Are you going to argue, oh, well, Paul is only arguing for women to be elders? No, that's not the way you do it. It is anyone. He uses the feminine form. Then when he goes into verse 2, he uses the masculine form. It encompasses everyone, not just one gender. Okay. So based on the rules of Greek grammar and usage, masculine terms and masculine forms can include both men and women unless something in the text specifies that the term is only referring to males. If there's something in the text that points us that it's only referring to males, then it's only referring to males. There is nothing in verse 1 and 2 that indicates that Paul is only talking to men, the male of the species. Nothing there. Again, when you go back, this is the same thing for Hebrew. It's the same thing for Spanish. I check with my friends who are fluent in Spanish. They are native Spanish speakers. They all told me, yep, that's true. And I've heard a lady who speaks French. She also confirmed, yep, this is what we do in French also. This is the rules. Okay, so we're dealing with the rules of language. All right, where these specific languages are concerned. So Mike Winger and Alan Parr and other complementarians who do this, they are mistaken to use the English translation, taking the word he, to conclude that these passages are referring to men only. They are mistaken. Alan Parr really did this. He doubled down on this. And when I mean double down, he's like, look, hey, it says husbands of one wife, husbands of one wife. And it says he. Look at all the third person masculine pronouns, which do not exist in the Greek. And Mike Winger, as we saw, did the exact same thing. They are mistaken for doing so. And let me say this real quick. I have a video called Should Egalitarians Repent? My response to Mike Winger. And this is when Mike did his last video, 4.5 hours, and he talked about that egalitarians should repent and that we have very bad theology that can hurt the body of Christ and that we need to repent and that egalitarian teachings are destroying marriages. I was incensed at that. I'll be honest with you. And so I did a 2.5 hour response to his 4.5 hour video. I talk about this point right here in that video. If you want to go back and watch it, I really break it down even more and talk about that. I did confront, or I should say, I tweeted to Mike Winger because when I said that he did not pay attention to the grammar in the Greek and to what Philip Payne said, Mike Winger accused me of making a straw man argument against his video. I sent him 18 tweets to say, no, I did not. Okay, go and watch the rest of the video to find out what happened. So I have talked with him about this. Mike said that he was going to he was going to do another video where he clarified his point of view. He never did. In the video that I just played, he says it later on. I think it's his last video. It's either video number 12 or the very last video where he talks about 1 Timothy chapter 3 again. He makes the same argument. He makes the exact same argument, makes the same mistake. Mike says that egalitarians will say these are all gender neutral. And he implies, and he basically says, no, they're not. Yeah, there are. Yes, they are. They're gender neutral. It starts off with the word tis. There is, again, let me say it one more time. There is no third person masculine pronoun in the Greek. It's not there. It's not there. Okay. So Mike is wrong. Alan Parr is wrong. You like Mike, you know Mike, you like Alan, you know Alan. Send them this video. Let them know that, hey, this guy, Mike Davis, is saying you guys didn't get this right. And they need to look it up because what they did was they read the English, they didn't check the Greek. Okay. And I'm really kind of surprised that Mike Winger did not check the Greek because he has this book and he said he read it. And Philip Payne talks about this in the book. And I'm really surprised that he did not quote Philip Payne on this. All right. So that's number 2. There are no third person masculine pronouns in the Greek at all. Fact number 3 that was missed and was left out. Husband of one wife does not exclude women. When it says that an elder, one of the qualifications, must be a husband of one wife, this does not exclude women. It does not exclude women, number 1, for the reason given above in fact 2. Masculine forms can include women as well as men. When the Bible says, you shall not covet your neighbor's wife, yes, it's talking to the husband, but it's talking to all of Israel, and they would have understood, oh, by the way, this means that you can't covet your neighbor's husband, also women, or kids, you can't covet what belongs to your friends. They would have understood this. It was all inclusive. So even though it says husband of one wife, a masculine construction, a masculine form, it would include all women. So it doesn't exclude them. So that's one reason. Let me give you some more. The phrase husband of one wife is a Greek idiom or a Greek idiom or a Greek figure of speech. What does it mean? It's a figure of speech. It's an idiom. It means it meant something specific within the culture. It was a way of referring to something that was specific to the culture. Like I have shared with you before, when I was growing up, my grandmother would say to me, if I was not listening to her, boy, you don't believe fat meat's greasy. That is an African American idiom that comes from the South. Okay, my family is from the South, on both my mom and dad's side. It is an idiom. You will not get this idiom simply looking up all of the words in a dictionary because an idiom idiom is formed by bringing all the words together, and all the words together give rise to the meaning. If you look up each word individually and focus on each word individually, it will never give you the meaning of "you don't believe fat meat's greasy." Not the way idioms work. It's not the way figures of speech work. The words take on certain connotations over time. Okay, this is how you get figures of speech. So, in the same way, husband of one wife is a Greek idiom. It's a figure of speech. What is it referring to? Is it simply saying that um, if you want to be an elder, you have to be married? No. Is it saying that if you want to be an elder or a pastor in the church, you can only be married one time, and if you got divorced and got remarried, you can't be an elder? No, not really, depending on the circumstance. What is it referring to? It means, or it refers to, marital and sexual faithfulness to one spouse. To be a husband of one wife, there's a corresponding term in, I think it's First Timothy. Let me hang on for a second. There's a corresponding term in First Timothy chapter, I think it's in chapter 3. Let's see. I'm looking at it now. Maybe it's chapter 5. I know it's one of the where it talks about that a woman is to be the the wife of one husband. And I'm not seeing it right now because I didn't have it in my notes. Okay, I won't. It is there. You can find it. You can read it. Okay, so uh, uh, yeah, you can read it. I think it's in chapter 5. We may come across it later, but there's a corresponding term, a wife of one husband. Okay, the idea of the figure of speech is that you are faithful to your spouse. You're showing marital faithfulness. It is a virtue. You're showing marital faithfulness. You are showing sexual faithfulness to your spouse. Okay. Let me read to you a quote from Dr. Christopher Hudson from his commentary on 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. I've quoted him before. He says, quote, in husband, and this is about what we just read, that a bishop, verse 2, must be blameless, the husband of one wife. He says this, quote, it is about marital fidelity. The common problems in Greco-Roman society were infidelity. This is especially among the men, though some women cheated also. But the common problems in Greco-Roman society were infidelity and serial monogamy. In other words, they were moving from one marriage to another. They would be married to somebody, and sometimes this is what actually happened with both men and women. Oh, tired of you, or I think I'll get a better deal over here with this guy. Going to divorce you. Going to go marry this person, and they would do that. Marriage was pretty. It seemed from what I've read, marriage was pretty. I mean, not marriage. Divorce was pretty prolific. They divorced a lot within the first century. Okay, let me go back. Husband of one wife is about marital fidelity. The common problems in Greco-Roman society were infidelity and serial monogamy. Our text, 1 Timothy 3:2, reflects a Greco-Roman ideal that only a few interpreters have appreciated. Ancient Greeks and Romans idealized lifelong fidelity to a single spouse, no adultery, divorce, or remarriage after the death of a spouse. While remarriage was accepted, even expected, lifelong fidelity or faithfulness to a single partner garnered high admiration. Such a person was, quote, a man of one woman. Now, that is literally how husband of one wife translates, or how it actually reads in the Greek. It literally says a man of one woman. And when it talks about the woman being a wife of one husband, it is a woman of one man. Okay, literally, that's how it can read, or how it translates, not translates, how it reads in the Greek. Okay, it says, so such a person was a man of one woman, this is the husband, or a woman of one man, that's the wife. Most examples of this ideal were women. Men who lived up to this ideal were less common, but similarly admired. So the most of the examples that we have of a woman who was only married to one person who was faithful to them, we got a lot of examples of those. We got only a few examples of the men, but when men were only married to one woman, even if their wife died, they didn't marry anybody else, they were highly admired. You remember the story of Anna the prophetess? When Mary and Joseph bring Jesus to the temple, and Anna the prophetess is there, and it says she spent her day and night praying and fasting, and it says that she only had one husband, and she had been single. I forget how many years it was, but it was decades. Now we miss this because we don't understand the culture, but it was praising her. It was showing that she was a woman of honor. Jesus was being blessed and he was being spoken over by this woman of honor because they bring out the fact that since her husband had died, and her husband died when she was young, she had been a widow all this time. She had never married again. In a first century Jewish and Greco Roman culture, this woman is called a univira. This means that she had been single. I mean, not single. Yeah, she hadn't remarried and she remained a widow all of her life. She was highly admired. She would be highly praised. And this is what the text is telling us when this woman comes to Jesus to speak to Mary and Joseph. This is a woman of great honor and esteem because she had remained single all of her life after her husband died. Okay. So this phrase, husband of one wife, again, number one, because it's in the masculine form, doesn't mean that it excludes women. It will include women in that. And also, it literally in the Greek, it says a one man, a one woman man, meaning that the husband is faithful to his wife. So the phrase, it means marital faithfulness again. It means marital faithfulness. Doesn't exclude women, it would include women. So the phrase does not by itself or in and of itself exclude women from the position of eldership. Doesn't exempt them from position of leadership, contrary to the emphasis given by Alan Parr and Mike Winger. They did not bring out the cultural background and concept of this idea of a one woman man or a one man woman. They just said it says husband. And again, not understanding, even if it's in the masculine form, we're going to talk about why it uses that for elders, including both men and women. But even if it's using that, again, according to the rules of Greek, Hebrew, Spanish, it will encompass both of them. Okay. Why is the masculine form used here, husband of one wife? Let me read you what Dr. Philip Payne said. And I found this to be interesting because I didn't know it at the time. I went, oh, well, thank you very much, Dr. Payne. This is from his book again, The Bible versus Biblical Womanhood. He says, um, okay, I'll just read it. This is from page 154. So when Paul tells Timothy that overseers or elders should be faithful people, he could choose either the masculine or feminine form of the idiom. Talking about the idiom we just read. Notice he calls it an idiom. Now, why did they use a masculine form? There is no gender neutral form of the idiom, such as spouse of one spouse. You could either choose the masculine or the feminine. There is no gender neutral term. So you've got to choose one or the other. He says there is no gender neutral form of the idiom, such as the elder needs to be the spouse of one spouse. It didn't exist in Greek. Convention, however, required the masculine form. Again, the rules required the masculine form of the idiom when referring to a group of people who might be either men or women. This is why the masculine form was chosen, because again, the Greek rule said if you're talking about men and women, or you could be talking about either men or women, you default to the masculine form. You default to the masculine construction to make sure that they both are included. So, when it says here, it shall be the husband of one wife, or literally, you shall be the elder must be a one woman man. Does that exclude women? No, it encompasses them because of the rules of Greek, because of the way because of the way Greek works. Now, listen, if you're a complementarian, you're watching this and you go like, well, I don't believe this. Argue with the Greek. Find something that would go contrary to the Greek where you can prove your point. But I'm telling you, this is what the scholars are telling us. This is how it works. Okay. So again, Winger's argument, Parr's argument that because it says husband of one wife, therefore it is restricted only to men and excludes women on the basis of the rules of Greek grammar, that doesn't work. Doesn't work. Okay. And by the way, if you say it does, then you have to say, well, thou shalt not steal, because in Hebrew it's written in the masculine. It only applies to men, not women. Thou shalt not kill only applies to men, not women. And I don't know anybody who would say that. Okay. Also, there are two complementarian scholars who, in their writings, they state that the phrase husband of one wife does not exclude women from being elders, even though they don't believe women can be elders. There are two complementarian scholars who literally state, they are on record as saying, just because it says husband of one woman does not necessarily exclude women, and does not restrict it to only to men. And they don't even believe women can be elders, but they go, you can't use that. Dr. Douglas Moo says this, who's a well-known New Testament scholar, and Dr. Thomas Schreiner, who's also a New Testament scholar, well-known. Again, reading from Payne's book. Let me read to you what because he has their quotes. I've read the article by Dr. Moo. He does say that. I went and looked it up. Now, keep in mind, these men do not believe women can be elders, but they were honest enough in their scholarship to admit you can't use husband of one wife to exclude women. It doesn't exclude women in and of itself. So this is what let me read to you first what Dr. Schreiner says. So Philip Payne has his quote. He says, Schreiner acknowledges the requirement for elders in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and Titus chapter 1, verses 6 through 9, including the statement that they are to be one woman men, he translates it literally, does not necessarily, in and of itself, preclude women from serving as elders. This is a complementarian scholar who says that. Dr. Moo writes this. He admits, quote, man of one woman, again, he quotes it specifically, how it reads in Greek, man of one woman need not exclude unmarried men or females from the office. It would be going too far to argue that the phrase clearly excludes women. And that's from Dr. Moo's article, The Interpretation of 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11 through 15, a rejoinder. It's a 1981 article. And Thomas Schreiter, his article, Philip Payne on Familiar Ground, a review of Philip Payne's Man and Woman, One in Christ. Okay, so both of these complementarian scholars acknowledge you can't use a one woman man to say, number one, well, you have to be married in order to hold the office. And number two, women are excluded because women can't be husbands. They said you can't use it because the term, and they acknowledge also the term refers to marital faithfulness. That's what the term is referring to. Okay. So again, Dr. Payne, in his book, Man and Woman, One in Christ, he has that argument in here. It's where I first learned it. And I went and checked it out with other scholars and I did some research and went, yeah, this, not that I didn't believe Dr. Payne, I just like to do extra research on my own. And what again, Mike Winger held up this book doing his series, talked about he read this book. He never includes that information. He doesn't include this information. And I wonder, it's like, why didn't he include that information from those two scholars? Because it's in Payne's book. I'm surprised that he did not. Okay. Mike also argues, and this is another argument that he makes, that in verse 4, go to verse 4 of 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 4 says that the elder, one of the qualifications, must be one who rules his own house well, having his children in submission with all reverence. For if a man does not know how to rule his own house, how will he take care of the church of God? Okay, so number one, we know that those third person masculine pronouns, not there in the Greek. Well, you said, Mike, in verse 5 says, if a man does not know how. Guess what word is there that's translated as man in my New King James? You know what the word is? Tis. It's the word tis. In other words, if anyone does not know how to rule his own house. Again, if you are a complementarian and you're watching this, or you're new to this and you're thinking, what, huh? Go look it up in the Greek. The word there where it says, if a man does not know how to rule his own house, doesn't say man. It says if anyone does not know how to rule his house, how will, and it should be they take care of the church of God, because the third person masculine pronouns are not there in the Greek. Not there. Okay. Mike argues that verse 4, one who rules his household well, would naturally have been understood in their day as referring to men. This is the argument that we saw him make. He said they would have understood that this is referring to men. Again, this is not necessarily so. As a matter of fact, it is wrong culturally and historically. It's just flat out wrong. In the first century, women also owned their own houses, their own homes, and they cared for their households. They cared for their families. Let me read to you from the book, Finding Phoebe by Susan Hyland. Finding Phoebe, Susan Hyland. Let me read to her several excerpts from her book, what she says about women owning their own homes. So let me start here, page 13. I've got several of them I'm going to read for you. In the mouth of two or three witnesses, let every word be established. She said, quote, that this is on page 13 of the book, that women owned property was fairly common in this period of Roman life. In fact, women owned about 1/3 of all property across the Roman Mediterranean territories. She goes on to say, quote, women were not equal to men in terms of ownership, but they did own a significant amount. In other words, men, it wasn't like 50-50 in terms of ownership. Men tend to have more than women in that time period. Women's property ownership was not something extraordinary, but a regular and expected part of the cultural landscape. Legal and social norms of the first century supported women's ownership of property. Okay, let me read to you now from page 17. She says, women owned the same kind of property that men did as well. They owned farmlands and animals, houses and apartment buildings, business and equipment. Women also possessed clothing, jewelry, and household goods, items that weren't disposable, and they often are as they often are today, but were handed down to one's children. Many people owned slaves, and documents from the period record both men and women buying and selling enslaved people. Slaves were considered to be part of your household. This was your household was known as the familia. When we get to Ephesians chapter 5, we're going to talk about that more in detail, in depth. Your household was known as the familia. Now, it sounds like our word family. It's more of household. Part of your household was not just your kids. It could also be the people who work for you. It could also be, or your clients. It could also be, and would be your slave. All of this was part of your household. So when it's talking about taking care of your household, it's more than just your 3 kids, your 2.5 kids. It could be your children, any slaves you have. There might be clients who work with you on a regular basis. They would be, or work for you on a regular basis. They would be considered part of your familia. And these are the people you had to take care of. Okay. Women, as well as men, were managers and rulers of their household. Okay. I'm going to share with you something else in just a moment. Let me read to you again from this book, uh, Finding Phoebe. This is a subchapter called Household Management. Dr. Highland writes, managing property and managing household affairs were in fact women's jobs. According to traditional gender expectations of the time, women's work, and listen to this, was not only cooking and cleaning, but also many of the tasks that kept the household going. Married women often were responsible for supervising their husband's property as well as their own. Notice that. They were responsible for supervising their husband's property as well as their own. Because in the first century Roman world, the properties, your property and your husband's property, were kept separate. So women have their own property even in the context of marriage. Even though Roman law insisted that the ownership of property by the husband and wife had to be kept separate, what I was just saying, the wife conducted many of the day-to-day affairs of the whole household. She was managing property. She was managing the slaves. She was managing business transaction. Being a quote homemaker, she more it was more of she was running the business of the family. This is what you usually and often married women and even single women were doing. They were married, they were running the business, the financial aspects of the family. All right, let me read to you something else. In terms of, I'll just read this one. Women in the New Testament also own property, and similar to other women of the time, they made decisions about how to manage their wealth. Okay, page 31. Rome viewed the property of husband and wife as legally separate. This point was quite important, and a number of laws in the Roman world reinforced it. The idea behind the law was important. Why? Families of both the husband and the wife should retain the rights to own their own property. So women kept their own property. It belonged to them, not their husbands. It belonged to the women. Okay. It was not under the control or the authority of the husband in the first century world. Okay. Few more, and then we're going to stop. Let me read to you couple more things here. Again from Susan Highland, quote, when ancient people thought of a household, this is again about household management, or of the private arena, they thought not only of feeding and clothing household members, but also all of the business and social endeavors of the family. Business was considered part of a private life. So even though ancient people imagined women's work as focusing on the household, it involved a whole lot more than what we considered household chores today. So these women were not just sweeping floors, mopping floors. They were taking care of the business the social and financial transactions of the household because the business was part of the household. She said, I mentioned a woman named Diogenes who wrote a letter giving instruction about family business matters. She told a male worker to sell the wheat, collect bronze items, collect money from someone who owed it, shake out woolen cloth, and look after the children. Today, we would consider the last two of these parts of excuse me. Today, we would consider the last two of these parts of household management. But for ancient people, the first three items were two. The first three items. What were the first three items? Told a male co-worker to sell wheat, collect bronze items, collect money from someone who owned it. This was also considered household duties. It was business. Women's household work included business affairs. Okay, so my point in reading all of that is to show it's the let me share something else before I move on there. Women own their own properties. This is one of the things that was said. We see this in the scripture. Go to Luke chapter 10. Luke chapter 10. And we see this in the Bible in the New Testament itself. Luke chapter 10. And this is about women owning their own house. Luke chapter 10, look at verse 28. Luke 10, I'm sorry, is it 28? No, 38. My reference is wrong. Luke 10:38. Now it happened as they went, talking about Jesus and his disciples, he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. Get that? Martha, of Mary and Martha fame, and she welcomed Jesus into her house, not her father's house, not her brother's house. Brother was Lazarus. It was her house. Martha owned her own house. Jewish women, as well as Greco-Roman women, own their own house. Go to Acts chapter 16. Acts chapter 16. And look at verse 13. This is when Paul is Paul has come to Philippi. It says, and on the Sabbath day, we went out of the city to the riverside where prayer was customarily made. We sat down and spoke to the women who met there. Now, a certain woman named Lydia heard us. She was a seller of purple from the city of Thyatira, who worshiped God. The Lord opened her heart to heed the things spoken by Paul. And when she and her household were baptized, when she and her household, when they were baptized, she begged us, saying, if you judge me to be faithful to the Lord, come to my house. And so she persuaded us. Okay. Now notice that Lydia was a seller of purple. She was in all likelihood a wealthy woman, or at least a well-to-do woman. Lydia was doing all right for herself. Okay. And she owned her own house. Remember, even within the Greco-Roman world of the first century, women in both the Greco-Roman world and the Jewish world could own their own property. They could own their own property. And Lydia did. Martha did. There are verses of scripture that talks about those that meet at Chloe's house. Chloe owned her own house. Nympha's house is a female. Nympha owned her own house. So women in the first century owned their own homes. And again, as we said, if Lydia is a seller of purple, she's probably running that business out of her home. So she's not just at home all day long watching TV. Okay, I know there was no TV, but she's not at home just sweeping the floor, mopping the floor. She's handling business day in and day out. She's handling finances. If she's got people working for her, she's telling people what to do. Okay. Women back then, they would have slaves and they would direct the women, they would direct the slaves what to do. But Lydia, Martha, other women own their own homes. Okay. Let me read to you something that I put on this morning on my Facebook page about what I was going to talk about and how Mike Winger says that when they would have read about rule your own household, they would have thought about men. That's how they would have understood it. That's how they would have interpreted it. Okay. As we're seeing, that's not true. When I wrote that, Dr. Cynthia Long Westfall, who's a friend of mine on Facebook, I've met her face to face, wonderful person. Got to interview her one day. Dr. Westfall, if you're watching, I do want to interview you. But she wrote in response to it, and I jokingly said to her, "You're giving away my message." But she wrote this. I thought it was good. She talks about go over to 1 Timothy chapter 5. Let me read this first. First Timothy chapter 5. Let me read something to you. First Timothy chapter 5, look at verse 14. Therefore, I desire that the younger women, that the younger widows or the younger women marry, bear children, manage the house, giving no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. Notice he wants the women who are young to marry and to manage the household. Dr. Westphal wrote this. The word for manage there is a Greek term, despotian, comes from the word despoteo, and the word means, according to Thayer's Greek English lexicon, to be master or head of a house, to rule a household, to manage family affairs. Now, as we know, family affairs includes what? Business, finance, managing servants, managing clients. It deals with all of that, not just sweeping the floor, making sure the beds are made before your husband gets home. Way beyond that. And if they were well-to-do women, as many of the women at Ephesus were, they had servants who took care of those things. And the women would manage it. And Paul is telling the women to manage. Dr. Westphal said this on my Facebook page. You can go check it out. She said, even if the strong sense of the verb is toned down to manage, there is a clear intertextual connection to 1 Timothy 3:4, where Paul says that an elder must rule his household well. So rule the household well, this is Dr. Westphal still, was a woman's responsibility according to Paul and according to culture. Men ruled in the public sphere and women ruled in the domestic sphere, like in Proverbs 31, the Proverbs 31 woman. And she says, though the authority of the woman of valor, the authority of the woman of valor in Proverbs 31 wasn't limited to the domestic sphere as it was in the Greek culture. In other words, in Proverbs 31, in ancient Hebrew culture, women were not just limited to the house, okay, or to the domestic sphere. I should put it like that, to the domestic sphere. You go back, you read Proverbs 31, her husband sits in the gates, but let's go over there and read it. It wasn't in my notes. Let's go over there and read it, okay? And I remember when I first learned this about women in the first century, my thinking when I learned this a few years ago went back to Proverbs 31. I said, these women in the Greco-Roman world of the first century sound like the Proverbs 31 women. Let me get a sip of water real quick. We're going to hurry up here. We're almost finished. Proverbs 31. We've got a few more things to cover here. Let's go over to Proverbs 31. Hope you're getting something out of this. If you are, leave a comment in the comment section. Let me know what you're thinking, how you're enjoying this, or if you got a pushback, I welcome the pushback. Proverbs 31. Let's start it from verse 10. Who can find a virtuous woman or a woman of valor? Notice this is a virtuous woman, by the way. It's going to tie in later. And notice how it talks about her virtue. Her worth is far above rubies. The heart of her husband safely trusts her, so he will have no lack of gain. She does him good and not evil all the days of her life. She seeks wool and flax and willingly works with her hand. She is like the merchant ships. She brings her food from afar. She also rises while it is yet night and provides food for her household and a portion for her maidservants. She considers a field and buys it. From her profits, she plants a vineyard. She girds herself with strength and strengthens her arm. She perceives that her merchandise is good and her lamp goes not out by night. She stretches out her hands to the distaff. Her hands hold the spindle. She extends her hand to the poor. Yes, she reaches out her hands to the needy. She is not afraid of snow for her household, for all her household is clothed with scarlet. She makes tapestry for herself. Her clothing is fine linen and purple. These folks are decked out. Her husband, known in the gate, he's in the public arena. When he sits among the elders of the land, she makes linen garments. And the implication seems to be here, in my opinion, that he's known in the gates, and part of the reason why, if not the full reason why, is because of his wife, because of her industriousness. Okay. She makes linen garments and sells them and supplies sashes for the merchants. Strength and honor are her clothing. She shall rejoice in time to come. She opens her mouth with wisdom. On her tongue is the law of kindness. She watches over the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed. Her husband also, and he praises her. Many daughters have done well, but you excel them all. Charm is deceitful. Beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. give her of the fruit of her hands, and let her works praise her in the gates. So we see that this woman is not sitting at home, sweeping the floor, just washing dishes. She is engaged in business affairs. This is also what they were doing in the first century world. By the way, I can say, in all honesty, I read this, I go, that's Karen Davis. That's my wife and my mother, Jacqueline Jefferson. My mother is this. I watched her growing up, and my wife is this. Okay. They are industrious women. They make things happen. All right. And I just sit in the gates. No, I'm just kidding. I also work. But my point here is that women did rule the household. And so Mike Winger and Dr. Westphal said Mike Winger is so incorrect when he says, well, you know what? When they read this, they would have only have thought of the men. Once again, trying to make the point that this is restricted to men. That when they read they read Paul's instruction that that those who want to be in positions of leadership must first rule their own household. And by the way, in the Greco-Roman world, the ideal was if you want to be in a position of leadership, you must first display that in your home, in the way you run your business. That becomes the prerequisite and the foundation for leadership elsewhere. So this is one of the reasons, this is right in line with Greco-Roman norms when Paul is saying, listen, if you want to be a leader in the church, you first need to demonstrate leadership in your home. Do you manage your home? Do you manage your business affairs well? Okay, then we want you to be a leader in the church. I know one of the things I'll come back to this later. Mike Winger kind of makes a thing out of Lydia being a possible leader of the church. He said, well, she just got born again, she got saved. But if you look at what number one, we don't know how much time Paul spent there specifically. At least I don't know yet. There might be some information on it. But Lydia said something to Paul I found very interesting. She said, "If you have found me faithful, come and stay at my house." Now she was Jewish, right? She said, "If you found me faithful, found her faithful, find her faithful how?" To me, this speaks of her reputation, and this is what First Timothy chapter 3 speaks about people's reputation, how they're seen. We're going to talk about that in a moment. How they were seen in the outside world. She was a woman of good reputation, meaning she probably, and in all likelihood, I believe she did run her household well. In other words, she had leadership skills. That's what I'm trying to say. She had leadership skills. So it would not be strange for Paul after he gave her some instructions on how, for lack of a way of putting it, on some instruction. I don't want to say necessarily biblical instruction, but instruction in terms of the Christian faith. I'll put it like that, and give her some and spend some time teaching her. She probably ended up being a leader because she had leadership skills. She was faithful. She probably had a good reputation as a woman who was a seller of purple. She demonstrated good leadership skills. I think that is implied there in the text. So when Paul says, rule the household well, people will have thought of women as well as men, not just men. Dr. Cynthia Long Westfall said Mike Winger is incorrect. I agree with her 110%. Mike Winger is incorrect. In the ancient world, ruling one's household was a prerequisite of leadership. And women, as we just saw, did this like men did. So Mike is historically, culturally, and linguistically wrong when he asserts that these passages point to men and not women as elders. That is all prerequisites for men, that is restricted to men. He and Alan Parr and other complementarians who operate with the same mindset, with the same ideas, the same criteria, saying that because there are masculine pronouns in the English, therefore is restricted to men, they are all wrong culturally, historically, and linguistically. They are wrong. This is not restricted to men only. It is open to women also. All right. So what is First Timothy as we begin to close here? What is First Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 about? How does it connect to First Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15? First of all, First Timothy chapter 3, let's go back there. First Timothy chapter 3. We're going to be going through it, and I'm going to close up here. It's First Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 is laying out, as we've seen, qualifications for being an elder, being someone who can help to lead the church, to grow the church, to develop the people. These qualifications are all virtues. The qualifications are all virtues. First of all, chapter 3, verse 1 says, if a man desires the position of a bishop, he desires a good work. Okay? So it says the person who wants to be an elder desires a good work. So that's a good thing, right? What does it say in chapter 2, verse 9 and 10? Let's go there. In like manner, also the women adorn themselves in modest apparel, with propriety and moderation, and not with braided hair or gold or pearls or costly clothing, but which is proper. This is how women are to adorn themselves. They are to adorn themselves with that which is proper for women professing godliness with good works. They are to adorn themselves with good works. What does it says here? The one who desires the office of an elder desires a good thing or a good work. Now, the word for good work in verse 10 of chapter 2 is different, a little bit different, slightly different from the word here, but it's the same idea. They are to clothe themselves with good works. To be a bishop is to desire a good work. Okay. The women are to be virtuous in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. They are to be doing good works. They are to be virtuous in good works. Verse 2 says, a bishop or an elder then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, temperate, sober minded. Now, notice in verse 2 it says that they must be blameless. Okay. And then if you look at verse 7, at the end, it says, moreover, the person who wants to be an elder must have a good testimony among those who are outside, lest he fall into reproach and the snare of the devil. So verse 2 says they are to be blameless. Verse 7 says that they are to have a good testimony and be above reproach, or to be without reproach. Now, why do I bring that out? The two words are similar. And what this is called is an inclusio. An inclusio. This is a rhetorical technique, an inclusio. It creates a rhetorical bracket. Okay. It creates a bracket, kind of like bookends. Okay. It's bookending some ideas, some themes. So you've got two themes here. It's actually one theme. You have the theme of being above reproach. You have the theme of having a good testimony, so you're not you don't bring reproach, or you don't get reproach from the outsider. It's the theme of being uh, above reproach. All right. So it starts at the beginning and it ends with the idea of being above reproach. Now, the reason that is important is by walking in virtues, the women would be seen as virtuous and above reproach, because everything that Paul talks about from verse 2 to between verse 2 and 7 all have to do with how do you avoid or how do you maintain being above reproach? How do you create a good testimony? Okay. So Paul starts off talking about you need to have a good testimony, you need to be above reproach. And he ends with you got to have a good testimony and be above reproach. Everything in between tells you how that happens. Everything in between has to do with these two bookends. Okay. So by walking in virtues in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15, Paul is telling the women. Now, if you go back and you study what everything I taught on this, one thing I kept saying over and over when I taught this originally, 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 through 12, you see a pattern where Paul is moving them away from vice and towards virtue. He's moving them away from that which is dishonorable. He's moving them towards that which is honorable. And I said it all the way down. He's moving from vice to virtue. He's moving from what is dishonorable to what is honorable. He wants them to walk in virtue, not vice. He wants them to walk in that which is honorable, not dishonorable. So if the women follow Paul's instruction, guess what they will be? Above reproach. If they walk in the vice, wearing all of this luxurious clothing, acting in ways in the community that would bring a reproach not only upon them, but upon their family and upon the community, that will cause them to be seen not as above reproach, but they will get reproached, and the community will get reproached, and the community will be criticized by the outside world. That's what Paul wants to avoid. So Paul is telling the women how to avoid reproach in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. Right? Let's move on here. He says, we read in verse 2, it must be the husband of one wife. This is, again, as we said before, this is marital faithfulness, that husbands and wife that they are to be faithful, or if it's a husband faithful to his wife, so a wife faithful to her husband. We talked about that already. Being faithful in terms of your marital and sexual faithfulness, this was seen as an expression of a virtue known as self-control. What does Paul tell the women to walk in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15? One of the virtues that he mentions at the very beginning, when he says, in like manner, also the women adorn themselves in modest apparel with propriety and moderation. I forget which of those words is sophrosune. That means self-control. At the very end, verse 15, nevertheless, you will be saved in childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with self-control. So once again, self-control forms an inclusio from verse 9 to verse 15. Everything in between has to do with exercising self-control so that you can walk in such a way that you are above reproach. This is what Paul is teaching the woman. Exercise self-control so that you move away from vice and you move towards and walk in virtue. Okay. The women are told we see here in chapter 3, they're to be temperate, sober-minded. Again, this has to do with self-control. They're to be hospitable. You say, well, does it mention hospitable here? Well, remember we said before when I taught on this earlier that one of the things that Paul, when he tells them not to wear all the expensive clothing and the gold and stuff in the hair, that was considered the vice of luxuria. And if you were involved in the vice of luxuria, it meant that you were not taking care of your house. This is how it was understood. You were not taking care of your household. But if you were to dress modestly, you exercise self-control, you would be understood as a woman who was taking care of her household, making sure her children were taken care of. And you would be seen as a woman who was taking care of the community. You would be hospitable. Okay. All right. Let me just move on real quickly here. Go over to chapter 5 and verse 10 real quick. Chapter 5, verse 10 says, verse 10 speaks about, again, the virtue that women are supposed to work in. Verse 9, do not let a widow under 60 years old be taken into the number, and not unless she has been the wife of one man. Once again, marital faithfulness. Oh, that's the word. That's what I was looking for. The wife of one man. That's the one I was looking for earlier. Okay. So a univera, she's the wife of one man. She's been faithful in her marriage, faithful sexually. Okay. Well reported for good works, if she has brought up children, if she has lodged strangers, if she has washed the saints' feet, if she has relieved the afflicted, if she has diligently followed every good work. So once again, this is what was expected of the women of the community. And by the way, this was expected of the men of the community. Hospitality was for men and women. That was a virtue that was an incumbent upon both men and women, not only in the church, but in the Greco-Roman world, in the Jewish world. Okay. But it was a virtue. Hospitality is a virtue. Okay. Moving on here, it says that women are to be, it says that the person who wants to be an elder, they are to be apt to teach. They should be able to teach. And that women are to be, let's say, apt, it says, let's see, apt to teach, not given to wine, not violent, not greedy for money. So let's talk about that for a second. The women are to be apt to teach. Remember in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 11, what does Paul tell them? I do not allow a woman to teach nor to have authority over. I mean, that's verse 12. He tells them that as women who profess godliness, they are to be clothed with good works or virtue. Then he says, let a woman learn in silence with all submission. Let a woman learn. They are supposed to learn. Now, how does that relate to being apt to teach? It could also, apt to teach is the idea, possibly a friend of mine, Nick Quitt, suggested that it also could include the meaning of that they are teachable. Now, he wasn't 100% dogmatic about it, but he said, could be. And he gave me some reasons why. At the very least, we know this. If you are able to teach, that means you had to be able to learn. You had to be open. And this is what Paul tells the women in verse 11. They are to learn. And he commands it. It's a command in Greek. Let the women learn. Now, why is that important? Because in Judaism, it was taught that one learned in order to teach. And as I have argued, the reason Paul was telling them not to teach was not because they were women. It's because they were spreading false doctrine. Therefore, they were to submit to the teachers, learn so that they could teach. Now, when it says in Judaism, he who learns in order to teach, that is the idea. The idea behind that is if you want to teach, okay? If you study, you should be able to teach. I mean, if you study and you want to teach, you've got to first learn. You must first learn before you can teach. So to become an able teacher, you must first be an able student. You must learn. And then once you learn, you can teach. You become apt to teach. So you see, I keep relating this back to First Timothy chapter 2. They also must not be lovers of money. Again, First Timothy chapter 2, verse 9 through 10 speaks to this, where Paul tells them, don't let it be the outward adorning with expensive clothing, because that can reveal the sin of luxuria, which means you are in love and you're indulging yourself, you're in love with material things. My point in all of this is that all of the virtues, all of the qualifications that Paul lays down in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, correspond to the virtues that he calls the women to in 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. The virtues in chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 correspond to, they relate to the virtues in chapter 2, verses 9 through 15. There is nothing in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 that excludes women from leadership, because it's all about virtue. So this means that 1 Timothy chapter 2, verses 9 through 15 connects with 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7. Okay, how does it connect? Here it is, and this is where I'm going to close. In calling the women away from vice to virtue, Paul is laying out for the women who want to teach, who want to lead, the proper path to leadership in the community of believers. If you watch my interview with Dr. Kenneth Waters, we talked about this, and we both agree that in 1 Timothy, that if you follow Dr. Kenneth Waters' view of 1 Timothy 2:15, Paul is calling the women to virtuous living. And then in chapter 3, he tells them and he tells the men, if you all want to be leaders, if you want to be elders, here's the path. Here's the path. He's already started talking about it with the women. He's calling them to virtue. He says, okay, I'm calling you to virtuous living. You want to be leaders? You got to move away from the vice, move to the virtue. Here's the path of leadership you've got to walk in. This is the path you got to walk in order to be elders. Now, listen, I want to share this too. Even if we say, well, in chapter 2, in verse 15 of First Timothy, Paul is talking about literal children. Let's say we go with the interpretation by Dr. Sandra Gland and Dr. David Moyer Hubbard, Dr. Moyer Hubbard. Let's say we go with that interpretation where it's talking about actual children. It still fits the idea that Paul's calling them to virtue. Why? Having children in the first century Greco-Roman world was seen by Romans as an aspect of virtue and godliness. To have children was an aspect of virtue and godliness. If you go over to chapter 5 of 1 Timothy, look at verse 14. Therefore, our desires that the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, give no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. How? By marrying, bearing children, managing the house. He goes on to say, for some have already turned aside after Satan, implying that there were those who were following a teaching that was telling the women not to marry, which means you're not going to have children, which was contrary to Rome. Rome saw that as suspect. In one sense, it was kind of against the law. Rome wanted people to marry and have children because that would contribute to the state. Now, I'm not saying that Paul here is telling them to contribute to the state. He's saying don't engage in behavior that's going to cause you to be looked upon with suspect by Rome. That will be seen if you're abstaining from marriage, if you're abstaining from having children, that is not seen as a virtue, that is seen as advice. I'm talking about first century, in the first century world. He goes on to say, if any believing man or woman has widows, oh no, let me go back to verse 15. For some have already turned after Satan. So verse 14, he says, let the younger widows marry, bear children, manage the house, giving no opportunity to the adversary to speak reproachfully. It's not talking about Satan. He's talking about those in Rome on the outside who are looking at these people who are a part of this new religion, which they already look upon with suspicion, and they're going, are these women not marrying and they're refusing to marry, they're refusing to sleep with their children? That's a no-no in Rome. Okay. He's telling them stay away from behavior that will be seen as ungodly, as not contributing to the welfare of the community. He's telling them to stay away from that. So even if we interpret 1 Timothy chapter 2 and verse 15 as referring to having actual children, I'm just saying if we were to do that, it would still work because in the act of having children, that is seen as godliness. And raising your children, that is seen as godliness, that is seen as a virtue. If we go with Dr. Kenneth Walters' interpretation, where he sees this as women giving birth to virtue and then living a virtuous life, it definitely fits. And it goes into chapter 3. He's telling the women to live virtually. And then he says, if anyone wants to be a leader, this is what you must do. You've got to live above reproach, which is what he's been telling the women all along. So rather than restrict women and exclude them, the qualifications in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, it confirms and reinforces what they must do to truly become proper and effective leaders or elders. It doesn't exclude them. There is nothing in the text of chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, that would exclude the women. If anything, it reaffirms and confirms everything that Paul taught them so that they can be leaders. Paul was putting them on a path of leadership. That's it. I hope you got a lot out of it. We are officially done with 1 Timothy chapter 2 and 1 Timothy chapter 2 period. Again, I say the women were not excluded. They were to be included. Everything in 1 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 7 does not exclude them. It includes them based upon the historical, cultural, linguistic, and literary context. Thank you for watching. I hope you got a lot out of this. If you are watching this on our YouTube channel, KIC TV. And by the way, if you're watching this on Facebook, this will be uploaded to our YouTube channel, KIC TV, within the next 24 hours. But if you're watching this on our YouTube channel, please hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share this video link with your friends who may say, hey, women are excluded. And it's because of all of the male pronouns in 1 Timothy chapter 3. Let them know, hey, I saw this guy named Mike Winger? No, Mike Davis. And he shared a different view. Watch him and see what he has to say. This will help to push our algorithm. We want to get this message out to more women, to more people, to be able to bless more people and bless a lot of women, to let them know you are not excluded from leadership in the church. So thank you for watching. Lord willing, we will see you next week. Bye-bye.